The boy who smelled like death. The son the vultures refused to return in the Appalachians. This is not a legend, whispered around campfires. This is a documented tragedy of the Pritchard family, hidden deep in the hollers of Harlan County, Kentucky, where the mountains kept secrets that would horrify even the most hardened investigators who discovered them in the bitter winter of 1967. In the remote valleys of eastern Kentucky, where coal dust settled on everything like a shroud and the nearest town was a 3-hour walk through treacherous terrain, the Pritchard family lived in complete isolation. Their homestead, a weathered cabin built sometime in the 1880s, stood at the end of a forgotten logging road that had long since been reclaimed by wilderness. No electricity illuminated their nights. No running water blessed their mornings. The time itself seemed to have abandoned this place, leaving the Pritchards to exist in a perpetual state of 19th century survival. The family patriarch Ezekiel Pritchard was born in 1891 to parents who were themselves first cousins. His wife Martha, born in 1898, shared more than just a surname with Ezekiel before their union in 1914. She was his niece, the daughter of his older sister who had died during childbirth. In the isolated Appalachian communities of that era, such arrangements were whispered about but rarely condemned. Survival trumped societal norms, keeping land within families, maintaining bloodlines, and simple geographic isolation made these unions almost inevitable in some of the most remote mountain settlements. By 1945, Ezekiel and Martha had produced 9 children. 7 survived past infancy, though each bore the unmistakable marks of their parents' shared genetics. Club feet twisted at impossible angles, eyes that refused to align properly, creating a perpetual unfocused gaze. Hearing loss that ranged from partial to complete. Speech impediments so severe that even family members struggled to understand certain words. But the family persisted, working their small plot of land, raising chickens, and maintaining a vegetable garden that barely sustained them through harsh mountain winters. The true horror began in 1946 when the eldest surviving son, Jacob, then 28 years old, began a relationship with his own sister, Rebecca, who's 23. In communities this isolated, where the nearest eligible partner might live 2 valleys away, and travel was treacherous, such unions occurred more frequently than historical records acknowledge. The Pritchard family had become so geographically and socially isolated that their gene pool had effectively become a closed loop, spiraling inward with each generation. Rebecca gave birth to her first child in April 1947. The baby, a girl they named Sarah, appeared relatively normal at birth, though she would develop severe skeletal abnormalities by age 2. Her legs bowed so dramatically that walking became impossible. Her spine curved in an unnatural S shape that caused constant pain. But Sarah survived living in that mountain cabin, her world extending no further than the family's 50-acre property. Between 1947 and 1959, Rebecca bore 7 more children to her brother Jacob. 3 died before their first birthday, their tiny bodies buried in unmarked graves behind the cabin. Their deaths never reported to any authority. The baby, a girl they named Sarah, appeared relatively normal at birth, though she would develop severe skeletal abnormalities by age 2. Her legs bowed so dramatically that walking became impossible. Her spine curved in an unnatural shape that caused constant pain. But Sarah survived living in that mountain cabin, her world extending no further than the family's 50-acre property. Between 1947 and 1959, Rebecca bore 7 more children to her brother Jacob. 3 died before their first birthday, their tiny bodies buried in unmarked graves behind the cabin. Their deaths never reported to any authority. The 4 who survived displayed increasingly severe physical manifestations of recessive genetic disorders. Microphyll, a condition where the skull and brain failed to develop properly, appeared in 2 of the children. Profound intellectual disabilities affected all 4. But it was the 5th child born on a frigid January morning in 1953 who would become known to the outside world by a name that still haunts the historical records of Harlan County. They called him Thomas, though the investigators who eventually discovered the family would refer to him only as Subject P5. In their official reports, Thomas Pritchard entered this world with a genetic condition so rare and so devastating. The fewer than 30 cases had been documented in global medical literature at that time. His body could not properly process certain proteins, causing a metabolic disorder that produced a distinctive, overwhelming odor that permeated everything he touched, everything he wore, and the very air around him. The smell was not merely unpleasant. It was the stench of necrosis, of tissue breaking down, of death itself. By the time Thomas was 6 months old, even his own mother struggled to hold him for extended periods. The odor embedded itself in fabrics and wood in the very walls of the cabin. Local wildlife, typically attracted to human settlements for scraps and refuse, avoided the Pritchard property entirely. Hunting dogs from neighboring homesteads, when brought within a mile of the cabin, would whimper and refuse to advance further. As Thomas Gray, the condition worsened. His skin developed lesions that would not heal. His teeth rotted and fell out by age 7. His internal organs were slowly being poised by the same metabolic dysfunction that created the horrific odor. But perhaps, most tragically, Thomas possessed a sharp, aware mind trapped in a body that was essentially decomposing while he still lived. He could understand his condition. He could feel the revulsion in his family members' eyes. He knew he was dying slowly, day by day, year by year. The family tried everything within their limited knowledge and resources. They bathed Thomas in creeked water mixed with lye soap that burned his deteriorating skin. They wrapped him in layers of old cloth, trying desperately to contain the smell. They built him a separate small structure, barely larger than a shed 50 yards from the main cabin where he spent most of his existence alone, isolated even from his already isolated family. By 1960, when Thomas was 7 years old, the family situation had become unsustainable. Ezekiel had died in 1958 at age 67, his body worn down by decades of hard labor and poor nutrition. Martha followed him in early 1960. Succumbing to what was likely pneumonia during a particularly brutal winter. The 4 who survived displayed increasingly severe physical manifestations of recessive genetic disorders. Microphyll, a condition where the skull and brain failed to develop properly, appeared in 2 of the children. Profound intellectual disabilities affected all 4, but it was the 5th child, born on a frigid January morning in 1953, who would become known to the outside world by a name that still haunts the historical records of Harlan County. They called him Thomas, though the investigators who eventually discovered the family would refer to him only as Subject P. 5 in their official reports. Thomas Pritchard entered this world with a genetic condition so rare and so devastating that fewer than 30 cases had been documented in global medical literature at that time. His body could not properly process certain proteins, causing a metabolic disorder that produced a distinctive, overwhelming odor that permeated everything he touched, everything he wore, and the very air around him. The smell was not merely unpleasant. It was the stench of necrosis, of tissue breaking down, of death itself. By the time Thomas was 6 months old, even his own mother struggled to hold him for extended periods. The odor embedded itself in fabrics and wood in the very walls of the cabin. Local wildlife, typically attracted to human settlements for scraps and refuse, avoided the Pritchard property entirely. Hunting dogs from neighboring homesteads, when brought within a mile of the cabin, would whimper and refuse to advance further. As Thomas Gray, the condition worsened. His skin developed lesions that would not heal. His teeth rotted and fell out by age 7. His internal organs were slowly being poised by the same metabolic dysfunction that created the horrific odor. But perhaps most tragically, Thomas possessed a sharp, aware mind trapped in a body that was essentially decomposing while he still lived. He could understand his condition. He could feel the revulsion in his family members' eyes. He knew he was dying slowly, day by day, year by year. The family tried everything within their limited knowledge and resources. They bathed Thomas in creek water mixed with lye soap that burned his deteriorating skin. They wrapped him in layers of old cloth, trying desperately to contain the smell. They built him a separate small structure, barely larger than a shed 50 yards from the main cabin where he spent most of his existence alone. Isolated even from his already isolated family. By 1960, when Thomas was 7 years old, the family situation had become unsustainable. Ezekiel had died in 1958 at age 67. His body worn down by decades of hard labor and poor nutrition. Martha followed him in early 1960, succumbing to what was likely pneumonia during a particularly brutal winter. This left Jacob, now Quadentytus, as the patriarch of a family that included his sister wife, Rebecca, their surviving children, including the decomposing Thomas, and several younger siblings, who were themselves products of Ezekiel and Martha's consanguineous union. family's isolation might have continued indefinitely, if not for a chance encounter. In October 1967, a surveying team from a coal company exploring the region for potential mining operations stumbled upon the Pritchard homestead. What they found there would lead to one of the most disturbing investigations into familial continuity ever documented in Appalachian history. Confiraggi. J. Incredao. The stories we uncover here are not fiction. They are the hidden tragedies that history tried to bury, and you need to witness them before they disappear forever. The survey team that arrived at the Pritchard property on October 14, 1967 consisted of 3 men. Richard Coleman, a 34-year-old geologist, Martin Alice, a 29-year-old surveyor, and their guide, a local man named Eugene Watts, who had lived in Harlem County his entire 53 years. Eugene had heard whispers about the Pritchard family throughout his life, vague stories about people who lived so far back in the mountains that they might as well have been ghosts. But he had never ventured to their property, and neither had anyone else he knew. The team as approach to the cabin was marked by an experience that Richard Coleman would describe in his official statement as the most profoundly disturbing sensory assault I have ever experienced. The smell reached them when they were still a quarter mile from the visible structures. It stopped all 3 men in their tracks. Eugene, who had served in World War II and witnessed the aftermath of combat, later stated that the odor was worse than any battlefield I walked through in France. It was the smell of human decay, but with an acidic chemical quality that made your eyes water and your throat close. As they approached closer, they could see the main cabin and several outbuildings in various states of disrepair. Chickens wandered the property, but notably, they stayed away from one particular small structure set apart from the others. No birds sang in the trees nearby. The usual mountain wildlife, squirrels, rabbits, even insects, seemed absent from this immediate area. Jacob Pritchard emerged from the main cabin when he heard the surveyors approaching. At 49 years old, Jacob appeared decades older. His face bore the unmistakable features of someone born from a consanguineous union. Eyes set too close together, a protruding jaw, and teeth that had grown in at awkward angles. He walked with a severe limp, his left leg noticeably shorter than his right when he spoke. His words were slurred and difficult to understand, a combination of a cleft palate that had never been surgically corrected, and severe hearing loss that affected his ability to modulate his own voice. The conversation that followed was brief and tense. Jacob was immediately defensive, ordering the men to leave his property. But Richard Coleman, deeply concerned by what he was observing, and particularly by the overwhelming smell, asked directly if everyone on the property was safe and healthy. Jacob's response was to retreat into the cabin, slamming the door. But the surveyors had already seen enough to warrant official intervention. Through a window of the main cabin, Martin Hayes had glimpsed several figures inside, including what appeared to be children with visible physical deformities. And that smell, that overwhelming stench of death, seemed to be emanating from the small, isolated structure they had noticed earlier. The men left the property but immediately drove to the Harlem County Sheriff's Office, arriving just before sunset. Sheriff James Dockery, a veteran lawman who had served the county for 19 years, listened to their report with growing concern. He knew the Pritchard name. Everyone in local law enforcement did. The family had been left alone for generations, largely because they caused no trouble and because the few times deputies had ventured into those remote hollers, they had been met with warning shots and hostile receptions. Mountain families valued their privacy, and the sheriff's department had limited resources to address situations that did not involve clear criminal activity. But the surveyor's description of children with obvious deformities and that inexplicable, horrifying smell compelled Sheriff Dockery to act. The next morning, October 15th, 1967, he assembled a team that included 2 deputies, a county health inspector named Dorothy Marshall and Dr. Robert Chun, one of only 3 physicians serving the entire county. They made the difficult journey to the Pritchard property, arriving around mid-morning. What followed was a confrontation that would be documented in official reports spanning over 200 pages. Jacob initially refused to allow the officials onto his property, standing in his doorway with an old rifle, not threatening, but clearly prepared to defend his family's isolation. It took nearly 2 hours of negotiation with Sheriff Dockery, repeatedly emphasizing that they were there to help, not to harm, before Jacob finally reluctantly lowered the weapon and stepped aside. Dorothy Marshall, who had worked in public health for 12 years, would later describe the interior of the cabin as the most heartbreaking scene I have ever witnessed in my professional career. 8 people lived in that 3-room structure. Rebecca, now 44, sat in a corner, rocking back and forth, her eyes vacant and unfocused. 3 of her surviving children with Jacob were present. Sarah, now 20, confined to a wooden chair because her skeletal deformities made movement impossible. Daniel, 17, who appeared to function at the level of a toddler despite his age. And Ruth, 14, who was blind and had a cranial structure that indicated severe 2 of Jacob's younger siblings were also present, both showing clear signs of consanguinity in their physical features. But it was the questioning about the source of the overwhelming smell that led to the most devastating discovery. Dr. Chun, conducting a preliminary health assessment of those present in the cabin, noticed that all the family members kept glancing toward the window that faced the small, isolated structure. When he asked directly if someone else lived there, the room fell into an oppressive silence. Finally, Sarah, despite her severe physical limitations, managed to speak in a weak, trembling voice. "My brother Thomas is in the shed. He has been sick his whole life. Please do not make him leave. He will die without us." Sheriff Dockery and Dr. Chun approached the small structure with extreme caution. The smell intensified with every step, becoming almost unbearable at a distance of 20 feet. The building was roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, constructed from weathered planks, with gaps between the boards. A small stovepipe protruded from the roof, though no smoke emerged. A wooden door hung slightly crooked on leather hinges. Dr. Chun called out, identifying himself as a physician and asking permission to enter. A voice responded from inside, weak, raspy, but unmistakably human and articulate. "I know why you are here. I have been expecting someone to come eventually. You may enter, but please, I ask you to bring me some dignity in whatever happens next." What they found inside that shed would haunt both men for the remainder of their lives. Thomas Pritchard, 14 years old, sat on a crude wooden cot, covered in layers of old cloth that had turned dark with bodily sickness. His body was a testament to the devastating effects of the rare metabolic disorder that had plagued him since birth. His skin were visible, showed extensive lesions and discoloration. His frame was emaciated, weighing perhaps 70 pounds. He had no teeth remaining. His eyes, however, were clear and alert, showing an intelligence that seemed impossibly cruel given his physical condition. The structure itself was a prison of suffering. Buckets in the corner served as his toilet facilities, a small collection of books, their pages yellowed and fragile, sat on a makeshift shell of evidence that despite everything Thomas had taught himself to read. A few drawings created with crude charcoal and pieces of scrap wood hung on the walls. They depicted mountains, birds, trees, the world beyond his shed that he could observe through the gaps in the walls, but could never truly experience. Dr. Chun's immediate assessment was clear. Thomas needed urgent medical intervention, but the complexity of his condition, combined with the severe neglect and isolation he had endured, meant that any treatment would be complicated. More importantly, the discovery of this family raised immediate legal and ethical questions. Were these children being held against their will? Had crimes been committed? How should the authorities respond to a situation where consanguinity had created such devastating human suffering? The immediate aftermath of the discovery set off a chain of events that would consume Arlen County as limited social services infrastructure for months. Within hours of Dr. Chun's preliminary examination of Thomas, an ambulance was called to transport the boy to Harlaner Hospital, the nearest medical facility capable of handling his complex condition. The journey alone nearly killed him. His body, so long adapted to the isolated existence in that shed, went into shock when moved. His blood pressure plummeted. His breathing became labored and irregular. At the hospital, a team of physicians worked frantically to stabilize him. Blood tests revealed the extent of his metabolic disorder. His body was essentially poisoning itself, unable to process certain amino acids that accumulated in his tissue, creating toxic byproducts that manifested as the horrific odor and contributed to the progressive breakdown of his organs and tissue. In 1967, before the advent of modern genetic testing and specialized metabolic treatments, there was little the doctors could do beyond palliative care. They could manage his pain, treat his infections, and provide basic nutrition. but they could not cure the fundamental genetic condition that was killing him. Thomas spent 6 weeks in a quarantined hospital room. The smell, even with constant ventilation and air filtration, permeated the entire ward. Nurses drew straws to determine who would attend to him, though, to their credit, Onse assigned most treated him with compassion and dignity. Thomas himself, despite his suffering, showed remarkable grace and intelligence. He asked questions about the outside world, about technology he had only heard about in passing, about life beyond the mountains that had been both his home and his prison. Meanwhile, county officials grappled with the situation at the Pritchard homestead. Children's services, such as they existed in rural Kentucky in 1967, were overwhelmed and underfunded. Dorothy Marshall conducted extensive interviews with each family member, trying to piece together the full scope of the situation. What emerged was a multi-generational tragedy that extended far beyond what the surveyors had initially discovered. Rebecca, Thomas's mother, had limited capacity to understand or explain the decisions that had led to a relationship with her brother. Jacob, when asked why she had entered into such a union, she could only say, "There was no one else." Jacob was kind to me. We were alone. Her intellectual limitations themselves, a product of her parents' consanguinity, meant she had never fully comprehended the implications of bearing children with her own sibling. Jacob, more articulate, but deeply defensive, maintained that he had done nothing wrong according to the understanding of his family and community. "My own mother and father were cousins," he stated during one interview. "My grandparents before them were related by the family. This is how it has always been here in these mountains. We keep to ourselves. We survive. We never ask for help from anyone, and we never cause trouble for anyone." The investigation uncovered family records, crude handwritten documents that Jacob's father, Ezekiel, had maintained that traced the Pritchard lineage back to the 1840s. What became clear was a pattern of increasingly closed consanguineous unions spanning 5 generations. The family tree was not so much a tree as a tangled vine looping back on itself repeatedly. First cousins marrying first cousins, uncles with nieces. In the later generations, as geographic and social isolation intensified with siblings Dr. Chun working with a geneticist from the University of Kentucky who traveled to Harlan County to consult on the case, attempted to map the genetic implications. In 1967, genetic science was still in its relative infancy. The structure of DNA had only been fully understood for about 14 years. Complex genetic counseling did not exist as it does today. But even with the limited tools available, the implications were clear and devastating. The geneticist Dr. Patricia Holbrook explained in her report, "Each instance of consanguineous reproduction increases the probability that recessive genetic disorders will manifest. In a typical population with genetic diversity, harmful recessive genes are masked by healthy dominant genes. But when close relatives reproduce, the chances of both parents carrying the same recessive genes increase dramatically over multiple generations of such unions. The accumulation of these genetic disorders becomes almost inevitable." The Pritchard family represented a case study in this genetic degradation. Ezekiel and Martha themselves, products of consanguinity, had passed on compromised genetics to their children. Jacob and Rebecca, both carrying multiple recessive genetic disorders, created offspring with even more severe manifestations. Thomas represented perhaps the most extreme example, a combination of rare genetic conditions that individually were uncommon, but together were almost unprecedented. But beyond the medical and genetic analysis lay a more profound human tragedy. These were not people who had chosen this suffering. They were victims of circumstance, of isolation, of poverty, of a culture and geography that had left them stranded in time. The Pritchard family had not violated laws as they existed in Kentucky in the 1940s and 1950s. Marriages between close relatives, while socially taboo, were not criminally prosecuted in many rural areas where such unions occurred with some frequency out of necessity and isolation. The legal system struggled with how to respond. Prosecutors in Harlan County considered various charges against Jacob, ranging from child endangerment to contributing to the delinquency of minors. But the reality was complex. The children, while suffering from severe genetic disorders, had been fed, clothed to the best of the family's ability, and sheltered. There was no evidence of deliberate cruelty or malicious intent. The suffering was a consequence of genetic inheritance, not active harm. In November 1967, A family court judge made the difficult decision to remove the youngest children from the Pritchard homestead and place them in a specialized care facility that had recently been established in Lexington for children with severe disabilities. Sarah, Daniel, and Ruth were transported away from the only home they had ever known. Sarah, despite her physical immobility, cried throughout the journey, repeating, "I want to go home," until her voice gave out. Thomas remained in the hospital. His condition had stabilized somewhat, but he would never recover. Dr. Chun made the compassionate decision to allow Jacob and Rebecca to visit him, supervised visits that occurred twice a week. During these visits, the family would sit in uncomfortable silence, unable to bridge the gap between their isolated mountain existence and this sterile medical environment. Thomas tried to comfort his parents, telling them, "You did the best you could. I do not blame you for my suffering here." Thomas wants you to understand something crucial. Think about what he said to his parents and comment below. You did the best you could because sometimes the greatest tragedies are not born from evil, but from circumstances beyond anyone's control. Thomas Pritchard died on March 3, 1968 at 2:47 in the morning. He was 15 years old. The official cause of death listed on his certificate was multi-organ failure, secondary to metabolic disorder. But the nurses who had cared for him during his final months knew the truth was more complex. Thomas had died from the accumulated effects of 15 years of genetic degradation, of isolation, of a body that had been fighting against itself since the moment of his birth. In his final weeks, Thomas had made a request that surprised everyone. He wanted his story documented. He wanted people to understand what had happened to his family, not to condemn them, but to ensure that others might avoid such suffering. Dr. Chun arranged for a court stenographer to record Thomas's testimony. The transcript of that testimony remains in the archives of Harlan County, a devastating first-hand account of life in genetic isolation. Thomas described his earliest memories. "I remember my mother crying the first time she held me when I was perhaps 3 or 4 years old. I could see in her face that the smell was unbearable, but she was trying so hard not to show it. I learned very young that I was different, that my body was broken in ways that could not be fixed." He spoke about his education. "My sister, Sarah, taught me to read when I was 6. She could barely see, but she had memorized passages from an old Bible that my grandfather had owned. She would recite the words, and I would follow along on the page. Later, when a traveling preacher came through and left some books at a neighbor's property 2 miles away, my father walked there and brought them back for me. I read those same 5 books hundreds of times. I memorized entire chapters because there was nothing else to occupy my mind during the long hours alone in that shed." He described the physical suffering. No, man, but I learned to exist alongside it, rather than fighting it. The smell which everyone found so horrible, I became blind too after a while, but I never became blind to the isolation it caused. I would watch through the cracks in the walls as my siblings played in the yard, and I understood that I could never join them, not because they were cruel, but because my presence made normal life impossible for everyone around me. Most heartbreaking was his discussion of his parents. "I do not hate my mother and father. They are themselves victims of something they never understood. My father can barely read. My mother has the mind of a child in many ways. They were raised in complete isolation, taught that their way of life was normal. How can I blame them for circumstances that were set in motion generations before they were born?" This testimony would become a crucial document in the broader investigation into isolated Appalachian families and the prevalence of consanguineous unions in remote mountain communities. The University of Kuki, as a Department of Anthropology working with medical researchers, launched a comprehensive study of genetic isolation in eastern Kentucky using the Pritchard case as a catalyst. What they discovered was sobering. In a survey of 12 remote holders in Harlan, Letcher, and Pike counties, researchers found evidence of consanguineous unions in 43 different families. Most were first or second cousin marriages, which, while genetically problematic, were not as devastating as the closer relations seen in the Pritchard family. But in 6 cases, researchers found evidence of uncle, niece, or even closer relations, often unreported and existing in such isolation that official records had no documentation of these unions or their offspring. ERS argued that the findings were necessary to address a genuine public health crisis. The debate raged in academic journals, and even in the Kentucky state legislature, where proposals were introduced to strengthen laws against consanguineous marriages and to improve social services in remote rural areas. For the Pritchard family, Thomas's death marked the beginning of a slow dispersal. Jacob, now 50 years old and in declining health himself, was allowed to return to the mountain homestead with Rebecca. County social workers checked on them monthly, ensuring they had basic necessities. The property was connected to a dirt road that the county improved slightly, making access less treacherous. Sarah, Daniel, and Ruth remained in the Lexington facility for the rest of their lives. Sarah died in 1983 at age 36 from complications related to her skeletal deformities. Daniel passed away in 1991 at age 41 from pneumonia. Ruth, the longest-lived of Thomas's siblings, died in 2004 at age 51, having spent 43 of those years in institutional care, never speaking, never seeing her world reduced to sounds and touches in the routine of the facility that became her entire universe. The shed where Thomas spent most of his life stood for several more years after his death. Jacob could not bring himself to tear it down or even enter it. Eventually, in the mid-1970s, it collapsed during a severe winter storm. They were buried in the small family cemetery behind the cabin near the unmarked graves of the 3 children who had died in infancy. The Pritchard property was eventually claimed by the county for unpaid taxes in 1980 and sold at auction. The new owners, a family from Virginia looking for recreational mountain land, tore down the remaining structures and built a small hunting cabin. They knew nothing of the property's history. The land itself kept no visible record of the suffering it had witnessed. The Pritchard case had lasting implications that extended far beyond Harlan County. In the years following Thomas's death and the publication of the University of Kentucky study, Kentucky lawmakers passed stricter regulations regarding consanguineous marriages. More importantly, the state allocated funding to improve healthcare access and social services in remote Appalachian communities, recognizing that isolation itself was a contributing factor to these tragedies. Dr. Chun, who had been so affected by his encounter with Thomas, devoted the remainder of his career to rural medicine and genetic counseling. He established a traveling clinic that visited remote mountain communities, providing basic health care and, crucially, education about genetics and family planning. He trained nurses and social workers to identify signs of genetic disorders early and to connect families with resources that might help. Dr. Patish, the geneticist who had studied the Pritchard family genetics, used the case in her teaching at the university. For decades, medical students learned about the Pritchard family as an example of the devastating cumulative effects of consanguinity. But Dr. Holbrook always emphasized the humanity of the family, insisting that her students understand these were not curious specimens, but real people who suffered through no fault of their own. The broader social impact was more complex. The Pritchard case, along with similar cases that came to light in the late 1960s and early 1970s, contributed to harmful stereotypes about Appalachian people. Popular culture seized on these stories, creating cruel caricatures that suggested genetic degradation was widespread in mountain communities. This was both inaccurate and deeply unfair to the vast majority of Appalachian people who lived normal, healthy lives. However, the cases also sparked important conversations about the intersection of poverty, isolation, and public health. They highlighted how geographic isolation, combined with limited education and healthcare access, could create conditions where harmful practices persisted across generations. They demonstrated the need for comprehensive rural development that included not just economic opportunities, but also education, healthcare, and infrastructure improvements. In the specific context of consanguinity, the Pritchard case and the research it inspired helped advance understanding of genetic inheritance and the importance of genetic diversity. By the 1980s, genetic counseling had become a standard part of family planning services in most of the developed world. Prenatal genetic testing allowed for early detection of many disorders. Public health campaigns emphasized the risks of close-relation reproduction. Yet, even with all of these advances, the human tragedy at the heart of the Pritchard story remains profoundly moving. Thomas Pritchard spent 15 years trapped in a deteriorating body, isolated in a shed, suffering from a condition that made his very presence unbearable to others. But through it all, he maintained his humanity, his intelligence, and ultimately his compassion for the parents whose genetics had doomed him. In his final recorded testimony, Thomas said something that the stenographer noted brought tears to everyone present in the room. "I have thought often about what my life might have been if I had been born into different circumstances. I could have gone to school. I could have had friends. I could have walked through these mountains without fear of how others would react to me. But I also think about my parents, my siblings, all the others in my family who never had chances either. We were all prisoners of something that started long before any of us were born. We now understand the genetic mechanisms that caused Thomas's condition with precision that would have seemed like science fiction to the doctors who tried to help him. We can screen for thousands of genetic disorders before birth. We can map entire genomes and predict with reasonable accuracy the risks of consanguineous reproduction. But what we cannot do, what science and medicine will never be able to do, is restore the lost possibilities of lives like Thomas Pritchard. We cannot give back the 15 years he spent in isolation. We cannot undo the suffering of his siblings, of his parents, of the generations before them who set in motion a genetic cascade that ended in such tragedy. The Pritchard homestead is gone now, reclaimed by the forest that always surrounded it. No marker indicates what happened there. Hiking trails cross the property and hunters use the modern cabin during deer season, completely unaware that they walk over ground that witnessed one of the most devastating cases of familial consanguinity ever documented in America. Thomas Pritchard's grave is in a small cemetery outside Harlem, marked with a simple stone that gives only his name and dates. The epitaph was chosen by Dr.